Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory. The 9th of October, 1886. The autumn sun still carried a ghost of warmth, but the light was a liar, stretching itself thin across the valley like a promise no one intended to keep. For Maren Dahl, that false warmth carried something worse than cold. It carried the particular cruelty of a season pretending there was still time. Her husband, Peter, had been dead 41 days. A logging accident on the upper slopes, where a widow-maker, a dead branch hung up in the canopy, had dropped silently and caught him across the back of the skull. The men who carried him down said he likely never heard it. That was supposed to be a comfort. It was not. The company had let her stay in the timber camp cabin through September, a courtesy extended the way one extends a hand to a drowning person, briefly and from a safe distance. But the new felling season required new men, and new men required housing. The eviction was not dramatic. It was clerical. Eldon Croft, the camp superintendent, appeared at her door on a Tuesday morning with a folded document and the expression of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary chore, like drowning kittens. He was not a villain, he was a bookkeeper with authority, a man whose compassion operated within the strict margins of a ledger. Mrs. Dahl, the company appreciates your patience during this difficult time, he said, reading from a prepared statement as though she were a creditor. However, as per Section 4 of the Housing Agreement, occupancy is contingent upon active employment status. Your tenancy is hereby concluded effective the 15th of October. He paused. He looked at her. And for a single scurrying moment something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been shame. He had a daughter Maren knew, a girl of 6 who liked to collect pine cones and arrange them on the front porch in rows. He cleared his throat. I am sorry about Petter, he said, and this part was not from the document. He was the best man with a cross-cut saw I ever employed. Then he folded the paper, placed it on the table between them as though it might burn his fingers, and left. 6 days. She had 6 days to find somewhere to exist through a Wyoming winter that the old cattlemen were already calling early and mean. The aspens had turned 3 weeks ahead of schedule, their gold already gone to brown. The elk were moving down from the high country in herds so thick they darkened the meadows. Every living thing with any instinct at all was preparing for something brutal. Marion went to the town of Garnet, 3 miles down the valley, a place that existed because of the timber company and the small cattle operations that clung to the foothills like barnacles on a ship. She asked at the boarding house. Full. She asked at the church. The pastor's wife offered her a meal and a Bible verse, but not a room. She asked at the general store, where the owner's wife looked at her with a particular expression reserved for stray animals, a mix of tenderness and the firm knowledge that feeding it would only make it stay. She was an outsider twice over. A widow, which made her an object of superstition in a land where death was common but never comfortable. And a Dane, a woman who still rolled her vowels in ways that made the American-born wives cover their mouths when they whispered. Peter had been the bridge between her and this place. Without him, she was a foreign word in someone else's sentence. Pity, she discovered, had a very short season in Garnet. It was quickly chased away by the mathematics of survival. Every family was calculating their own firewood, their own flour stores, their own odds. No one had surplus compassion to burn. On the 4th day, sitting on a stump behind the boarding house, where she had been allowed to store her belongings under a tarp, Maren opened Peter's journal. He had kept it since before they married, a battered thing bound in dark leather with pages that smelled of wood shavings and linseed oil. Peter had been the son of a Danish potter, a man who fired kilns in the old way, using the earth itself as an oven. Before they emigrated, Peter had worked alongside his father building masonry stoves and pottery kilns throughout Jutland. She turned the pages slowly. His drawings were meticulous. Cross-sections of kilns showing airflow patterns. Notes on how fired clay absorbed heat and released it slowly over hours. Diagrams of how his father would build a kiln half buried in a hillside, using the constant temperature of the deep earth as a starting point, so less fuel was needed to reach firing temperature. She could hear Peter's voice as she read his annotations, that patient, methodical tone he used when he was explaining something he loved. The surface is a fool, Maren, he used to say, tapping whatever ground they stood on. Up here, the temperature is a tyrant. Hot in summer, cold enough to kill in winter. But go down 3 feet, 4 feet. The earth does not care what the sky is doing. The earth remembers its own temperature, and it does not change its mind. She had thought it charming, a potter's philosophy. She had not thought it was a survival manual. On the 5th day, the thing she needed found her. She was walking the creek that ran along the base of a sandstone bluff a mile north of Garnet, looking for nothing in particular, when she noticed something odd about the rock face. A section of the bluff, perhaps 30 feet wide, was stained dark with mineral deposits, and at its base, where the creek bent closest to the stone, the snow had melted in a ragged semicircle. She knelt and put her bare hand against the wet rock. It was warm, not hot, not steaming, but unmistakably, impossibly warm, like the flank of a sleeping animal. She had heard Peter talk about this. Geothermal seepage, he called it, places where the heat of the deep earth found pathways to the surface through fractures in the rock. Wyoming was riddled with it. The great geysers at Yellowstone were only the most dramatic expression of a force that operated everywhere beneath these mountains, quietly, invisibly, warming stone and water in places no one thought to look. Above the warm seepage, set back into the bluff face, she found a shallow alcove, perhaps 8 feet deep, carved by centuries of frost and water into the soft sandstone. It was not a cave, it was barely an overhang. The men of Garnet would have walked past it without a second glance. But Marin did not see what it was. She saw what it could become. She pressed both palms flat against the back wall of the alcove. Warm. The geothermal heat was radiating through the stone itself, turning the entire bluff face into a massive, slow hearth. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth move through her frozen fingers and up into her wrists, and something shifted inside her, a lock turning. She started that same afternoon. The first task was the most brutal. Using Peter's hand drill and a small mason's chisel she found in his toolbox, she began to deepen the alcove, chipping away at the soft sandstone inch by inch. The rock came away in pale orange chunks that smelled of chalk and iron. By the end of the first day, her hands were raw and her shoulders burned with a pain that went all the way to the bone. She had gained perhaps 10 inches of depth. It was nothing. It was everything. She worked in a pattern. Mornings she spent at the bluff cutting stone. Afternoons she hauled materials. She dragged deadfall timber from the creek bottom, selecting pieces that were dense and dry, avoiding the punky wood that would rot. She collected clay from a deposit she found upstream, thick red stuff that stuck to her fingers and smelled of copper. She gathered stones from the creek bed, smooth, fist-sized cobbles that Peter's journal told her would serve as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it through the night. By the end of the first week, the alcove was 6 feet deep, and she had begun to build the front wall. This was where Peter's knowledge became something more than sentiment. She built it not of logs, but of stone and clay, a thick wall nearly 2 feet across, using the same technique Peter's father had used for his kilns. She laid creek cobbles in courses, packing red clay between them, pressing it firm with her fists, and then smoothing it with the back of a wooden spoon. The wall would be massive, heavy, dense, and that was the point. It was not a barrier, it was a battery. A wall of wood is a blanket, Peter had written. It slows the cold but holds no warmth of its own. A wall of stone and earth is a stove. Feed it heat once and it will feed you heat for hours. She left a narrow opening for a door, framed with the straightest timber she could find, and a small gap near the top for ventilation. The ventilation gap was critical. Peter's journal was emphatic on this point. Without airflow, the fire would consume the oxygen and fill the space with smoke, but too much airflow would steal the heat. The gap had to be sized precisely, large enough to draw the smoke out, small enough to keep the warmth in. She cut a piece of flat sandstone that could be slid across the gap to adjust the opening, a damper as simple and effective as the ones in Peter's father's kiln. The second week brought the first real snow. Not the killing blizzards that would come in December, but a steady, persistent fall that turned the world white and dropped the temperature to well below freezing at night. Marin worked through it, Her fingers cracked and bled. She wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and kept going. She built a sleeping platform along the back wall, elevated a foot above the floor, directly against the warm sandstone. The geothermal heat was strongest here, and on the coldest nights, the rock surface held a temperature that she estimated was near 50 degrees. Not warm by the standards of a parlor, but when the air outside was 20 below zero, 50 degrees was the difference between life and death. She lined the platform with pine boughs, layered thick, and over those she spread the elk hide that had been Peter's bedroll. The smell was extraordinary. Pine resin and tanned leather and the mineral tang of warm sandstone, a scent that belonged to no place she had ever been, and yet felt like the first place that had ever belonged to her. The floor she covered with flat stones set in clay, creating a surface that absorbed the heat from her small fire and radiated it upward. She built the fire pit against the front wall, close to the ventilation gap, so the smoke would rise and exit without filling the shelter. The fire did not need to be large. That was the revelation. In the log cabins of Garnet, men built roaring fires that consumed cord after cord of wood, because most of the heat escaped through the thin walls and the gaps between the logs. Marin's fire was small, barely larger than a dinner plate, but the heat it produced was captured by the stone wall, absorbed into the clay and cobbles, and released slowly, steadily, for hours after the flames died. She tested it on a night when the temperature dropped to 4 below zero. She let the fire burn for 2 hours before bed, then let it die to coals. When she woke at dawn, the interior of her shelter was still warm enough that she could see no trace of her own breath. She lay there on the elk hide, her hand pressed against the warm sandstone wall behind her, and listened to the wind screaming over the bluff above. For the first time since Peter died, she did not feel like a woman being erased by the world. She felt like a woman the world had failed to erase. Word reached Garnet, as it always does in small places. A trapper named Macaulay had seen smoke rising from the bluff and investigated. He reported back that the widow doll was living in a hole in the rock, like a badger. The reaction was what you would expect. "She has lost her mind," said the pastor's wife over a church supper, shaking her head with an expression that was 3 parts concern and 1 part satisfaction. Eldencroft heard the story at the company office and paused over his ledger for a long moment. He thought about the document he had placed on her table. He thought about his daughter arranging pine cones in neat, careful rows. He said nothing and returned to his figures, but his pen did not move for several minutes. Silas Morrow, the most respected cattleman in the valley, and a man who had survived 30 winters by the simple creed of building thicker walls and burning more wood, was less restrained. He rode out to the bluff on a gray November afternoon, his horse stamping and blowing in the cold. He stood before the alcove and looked at the stone and clay wall, the narrow door, the thin wisp of smoke curling from the ventilation gap. "Mrs. Doll," he called. "You come out of there." Marn appeared in the doorway, her face smudged with soot, her hair tied back with a strip of leather. She did not look mad. She looked busy. "You are living in a crack in a rock," Silas said, not unkindly. "This is not a shelter. This is a slow way to die. The first hard freeze will crack the stone and bring the whole face down on your head. You are digging your own grave." Marion looked at him. She looked at the bluff above, which had stood for 10,000 years and showed no inclination to fall. She looked back at Silas. "Thank you for your concern, mister." "Morrow," she said, and she went back inside. Silas shook his head and rode back to Garnet. He told the men at the feed store that the Danish woman was finished. He said it was certainty because he was a man who had never been wrong about winter. He had built his ranch house with triple-chinked logs and a stone fireplace you could stand in. He burned 8 cords of wood every winter. He understood survival the way a general understands war, through force, through overwhelming the enemy with resources. December came like a door slamming. The first true blizzard struck on the 11th, a howling horizontal wall of snow driven by winds that snapped fence posts and buried cattle standing upright. The temperature dropped to 31 below zero. The air itself became a weapon, crystalline and sharp, freezing exposed skin in minutes. Garnet hunkered down. Fires roared in every cabin. Wood consumption doubled, then tripled. The snow piled so deep against the walls of the buildings that men had to dig tunnels from their front doors to reach the street. The supply road to the railhead became impassable. By Christmas, the first signs of crisis appeared. The Bradley family, who lived on the eastern edge of town, ran out of firewood. Their cabin, built in the standard fashion with single log walls and the simple fireplace, hemorrhaged heat. Ice formed on the inside of their windows, then on the inside of their walls. They moved in with the Morrisons, doubling the demand on the Morrison wood pile. By January, the pattern was repeating across Garnet. The winter was not merely cold. It was historic, the kind of cold that entered the folklore of a region, the winter of '86, spoken of in the same hushed tones as plagues and floods. Silas Morrow's 8 cords of wood were 6, then 4, then 3, and the snow was still falling. His triple chinked walls, the finest in the valley, were losing heat faster than his massive fireplace could produce it. He could feel the cold pressing through the logs like a living thing testing for weakness. And in the bluff above the creek, Marin Doll slept with one blanket. Her shelter did not fight the winter. It absorbed it. The 2-foot-thick stone and clay wall held the day's modest fire heat and released it through the night in a slow, steady pulse. The geothermal warmth from the sandstone at her back never wavered, never diminished, a constant 50 degrees that owed nothing to firewood or human effort. The ventilation gap, carefully dampered, kept the air fresh without stealing heat. Her wood consumption was perhaps a quarter cord per month, a fraction of what the cabins in Garnet required. She was warm, not comfortable in the way of a heated parlor, but warm in the way that mattered, warm enough to sleep, to think clearly, to wake with feeling in her fingers and toes. She was warm and she was alone, and the solitude had become less a punishment than a kind of conversation with herself, and with the journal that lay open each night on the shelf she had carved into the sandstone wall. The breaking point came in February. Silas Morrow's prize bull, a Hereford he had paid $200 for, froze to death in its shed. The shed had been built to Silas's specifications, sturdy, tight, well-roofed. But the cold was beyond specifications. Silas stood over the frozen animal and felt something crack inside his own certainty, a seam of rotten shale giving way. He saddled his horse that afternoon and rode to the bluff. The trail was barely passable, drifted deep with snow. When he reached the alcove, he saw the thin curl of smoke and smelled pine burning, and he stopped. He stood there for a long time in the howling wind, his face covered in frost, his thick wool coat insufficient against a cold that had made a joke of everything he knew about building and surviving. Marin opened the door. She saw his face. There was no arrogance left in it. There was something she recognized because she had worn it herself on the night she stood beside her belongings in the snow outside the company cabin. It was the face of a person who has reached the end of what they know. She stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. He ducked through the narrow doorway and stood in the warm, still air of the shelter. He pulled off a glove and placed his bare hand against the clay and stone wall. Warm. He put his other hand on the sandstone at the back. Warm. He looked at the tiny fire, no larger than what you might use to heat a pot of coffee. He looked at the ventilation gap, the careful damper, the elevated sleeping platform against the warm rock. "This is impossible," he said. "It is not," Marin said. "It is only unfamiliar." He stood there for a long time in silence. The wind screamed over the bluff above, and inside the shelter the small fire ticked and popped in the warmth held, steady as a heartbeat. "How?" he said. "Not a question. A surrender." She showed him Peter's journal. She showed him the diagrams of the kilns, the notes on thermal mass, the calculations of heat retention in clay versus wood. She explained it simply, the way Peter had explained it to her, using his words. "A log wall is a coat," she said. "It slows the cold, but it holds no heat of its own. When the fire dies, the cold returns immediately. A wall of stone and packed earth is different. It drinks the heat, it stores it. And when the fire dies, the wall remembers, and it gives the heat back, slowly, for hours." She pointed to the back wall. "And this. The earth beneath us is warm, not hot, just warm, steady. It does not care if there is a blizzard. It does not change. Build against it and you start with warmth before you ever light a fire. Silas Morrow listened to every word with the intensity of a man hearing a new language for the first time and recognizing, with a shock, that it described things his own language had no words for. When she finished, he looked at her, and then he did something she did not expect. He apologized, not elaborately. Not with excuses, he simply said, "I was wrong, Mrs. Dull. I was wrong and you were right, and people may have suffered for my certainty. I am sorry." Then he asked her to teach him. She did, without condition and without reproach. Over the following weeks, as the worst winter in Wyoming memory continued to punish the valley, Silas Morrow became an unlikely student. He brought men from Garnett to the bluff. They stood in Marin's shelter with their hats in their hands, feeling the warm walls, studying the ventilation, asking questions with the humility of children. Silas adapted the principles for the existing cabins. They could not rebuild from scratch, but they could retrofit. They packed earth and sod against the north walls, creating berms that added thermal mass. They built smaller masonry cores inside their existing fireplaces, dense structures of stone and clay that captured heat and released it over hours instead of sending it straight up the chimney. They reduced their ventilation gaps and added dampers. The effect was immediate. Wood consumption dropped by half. Cabins that had been barely survivable became tolerable. Garnett survived that winter. Not all of the cattle did, and not all of the outlying homesteads, but the town itself held. And the reason it held, walked among them each day with soot on her hands and a dead man's journal in her coat pocket. When spring finally came, late and grudging, the snow pulling back from the valley like a retreating army, the people of Garnett did not go back to their old ways entirely. The berms stayed, the masonry heaters stayed. Silas Morrow spent that summer rebuilding his ranch house with walls 2 feet thick, stone and earth and clay, oriented against a south-facing hillside. He never burned more than 3 cords of wood in a winter again. Marin stayed in her shelter in the bluff. She expanded it over the years, deepening the alcove, adding a second chamber, fitting the door with proper hinges that Eldon Croft brought to her one spring afternoon without explanation or apology, just a quiet nod and the hinges held out in both hands like an offering. She planted a garden in the warm soil at the base of the seep. She taught anyone who asked. Travelers passing through the Wind River Valley in the years that followed would sometimes notice the strange dwelling in the sandstone bluff, the thin smoke, the neat garden, the stone and clay wall that seemed to grow from the rock itself. They would ask about the woman who lived there, and the people of Garnett would tell them, with a particular kind of pride that only people who have been wrong and learned from it can carry. On the last page of Peter's journal, in his careful hand, there was a drawing of a kiln built into a hillside, and beneath it a single line in Danish that Marin had translated in pencil in the margin. It read, "Give the heat a home and it will never leave you." Marindal added nothing to that page. But on the shelf above her sleeping platform, carved into the warm sandstone with a chisel, she had scratched 5 words that no one saw until after she was gone. They were not a lesson, they were not a moral. They were what a woman writes when she has proven that the earth remembers, but people forget. Peter, I found the warmth. Now, this story is over, but the question it leaves is not. You are not a widow on a frozen bluff in Wyoming. Your blizzard does not come with snow. It comes with bills, or a diagnosis, or a silence in your house that gets louder every year. And the conventional wisdom around you is the same as it was in Garnett. Build thicker walls. Burn more fuel, work harder, spend more, fight, but what if the answer is not fighting harder? What if it is digging differently? What warmth is sitting 3 feet beneath the surface of your life, steady and constant, ignored because no one ever taught you to look down instead of out? What knowledge did someone leave you, a parent, a teacher, a friend who is gone now, that you dismissed as quaint, as old-fashioned, as irrelevant to your modern blizzard? What crack in what rock face have you been walking past every single day? The people around you will say it is madness. They will say you are digging your own grave. Let them say it. Your bluff is waiting. Your warmth is there. It has always been there. Start digging. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival, geothermal energy, and thermal mass construction. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.